I'm Dan Isaac with the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Boise, Idaho. I'm here today to talk about and run through some slides just demonstrating the application of a new method that we've developed that uses underwater epoxy to attach small temperature sensors to large rocks and boulders and streams. That makes it a little bit easier to monitor full-year stream temperatures. My collaborators on this work are Donna Horan and Sherry Woolrab, both of whom are also fisheries biologists within the aquatic sciences lab that we have here in Boise. And before I get going then, one thing I should just mention, even though all of the applications and the validation work that we've done today basically was done with small digital temperature sensors, given that there's a lot of additional types of sensors out there now that are becoming smaller and smaller and battery lives are improving, all we're really demonstrating here is using glue to stick something onto a rock. So potentially this sort of protocol could be used for other sorts of sensor devices in streams as well. So before I get into kind of running through some of the validation work that we did to develop the underwater epoxy protocol, just a few slides here to kind of run through some of the original motivations for the work. We're fisheries biologists here in this lab, and so we're very interested in what aquatic organisms are doing. Temperature is one of the most important environmental variables for critters that live in streams, because most of those critters are cold-blooded, i.e. their metabolism, their growth, their abundances are strongly controlled by temperature. So it's critical that we have a better understanding of what's going on in different parts of the landscape. And there's been a lot of work done that links fish to thermal regimes in streams, but kind of the take-home here is just highlighted in these two bottom panels. You can see strong trends in the abundance of different fish species, whether it's the rate at which they're growing or just their numbers within a particular reach of stream across a broad temperature spectrum. And so if we can get a better handle on what the spatial and temporal distribution of temperatures are across big river networks, then that's going to give us a lot better ability to predict and understand what's going on with regards to what types of different critters live in what parts of those stream networks. Another thing that other folks, especially within regulatory agencies, might be interested in when it comes to stream temperatures and thermal regimes is just from the regulatory point of view. Agencies like state DEQ offices, federal EPA administration, they've got various thermal criteria that apply to inland waterways, and there's certain specific criteria then that can or cannot be exceeded in different parts of the world. So there's a strong interest in getting a better understanding of what, again, temperatures are like in different parts of river networks, so you can understand when and where those potential criteria are exceeded. And then, of course, as we're all aware now, temperatures are rising with global climate change occurring. Most of the records that we have available are based on air temperature trends, as this graph shows. But in places where we've got good long-term records of stream and river temperatures, like these time series from some European rivers, we can also see aquatic systems warming up over the last century or so as well. And so there's a lot of impetus in terms of trying to collect more temperature data, trying to establish long-term temperature monitoring sites so that we can start to better describe and characterize some of these phenomena. So that being said, the last couple of decades have seen an explosion in terms of the amount of temperature monitoring work that's going on. In a part of the United States that I live in, the northwestern U.S., we've literally got armies of people running around the forest and putting temperature sensors out in streams. There's dozens of different natural resource agencies that are involved in collecting this sort of information. Unfortunately, at this point, we haven't been very well coordinated in certain cases, so we're collecting, at times, somewhat redundant data, but it's good overall that we're getting a lot more of this sort of information now, and it's made much temperature database that we've developed for a regional river temperature model that we've been working on. The domain we're looking at here is what we call the Lower Snake Hydrologic Region. It encompasses a big chunk of the state of Idaho, as well as the tips of Washington and Oregon. And last year, when we were trying to pull this database together, we basically contacted a dozen or so different agencies just to find out what folks had or what information they'd collected from this particular part of the world. By the time we'd gotten copies of their data from them and organized that into a database for the Lower Snake, we had 6,700 summers of continuous temperature measurements at about 2,000 unique sites. And so there's a huge amount of this information out there. A lot of times, though, it's scattered across different agencies and different databases, so we don't know exactly how much until we try to pull it together for efforts like that. One of the limitations, though, to that previous database that we just looked at, and many other databases in mountainous parts of the world, is that there's concerns given that a lot of the streams in mountain environments are driven by snowmelt runoff, and you get a really big flood each year. There are concerns about losing your instruments. And so typically what people do then, or have done in the past, is they'll go out and they'll collect summer data only. So they'll go out at sometime in late June, early July, when the spring snowmelt pulse has kind of passed and things are settling down a little bit. They'll put a temperature sensor out, and then they'll run back to that place in September, maybe early October, to retrieve that temperature sensor before you start getting a lot of snow in these areas, and you can't logistically make it back to a lot of these places. And so 95% of the data that we have in those big temperature databases is just this summer data only. And so that gives us a pretty myopic view a lot of times of what's going on with regards to thermal regimes and streams. And that's unfortunate because fish and other aquatic organisms, that are strongly temperature dependent, they're doing things year-round that are controlled by temperature. So ideally, we would want to have a full measure of that annual thermal cycle in streams if we could get it. And so that's a lot of the impetus then behind why we tried to start thinking about developing an easy protocol that could facilitate doing more of this full-year temperature monitoring. Another factor that motivated us to want to develop a protocol was that we've got a lot of land to cover. The agency that I work with, the U.S. Forest Service, the lands that we administer cover about 10% of the lower 48 states, and on that 10% of the land surface area, we estimate there's approximately 500,000 stream kilometers that potentially are large enough to have fish in them. And so there's a huge amount of area to cover, and a lot of times, these are really remote landscapes as well. So, the thought of having to go back to each of these individual sites, as pretty as some of these landscapes are, that's not necessarily always a bad thing, but it does double the amount of travel that you have to do, and ultimately then you're doing that to collect 2 or 3 months of data, when it would be much more efficient if you could just simply lock a temperature sensor in place and then let it run, collect data for a year, 2 years, or more, and come back to that site once a year or once every few years, as opposed to having to make 2 trips there every year. And so one of the last things that has removed the potential obstacles in has been the increase in recent years in the capacity of the batteries for extended deployments, and also increases in memory capacity, so that these small digital temperature sensors can store now more temperature data. And so there's a lot of different instruments out there. The top 2 in this graph, the onset tidbit, that's one that we use a lot. We kind of like it because it's got a good 5-year battery life. It's already waterproof when you take it out of the box. You don't got to do a lot of fiddling around with it. It's relatively small size, and it's got a good memory capacity too. So you can change the logging interval on those to make that memory last longer periods of time, just depending on how frequently you want to collect information. Maxim makes another popular one, the I button, and those are nice if you want to collect or put out lots of instruments. They're a little bit less precise, they're less expensive, but they also have smaller battery and memory capacities. And one of the drawbacks to these instruments that we've found at least is that they're not waterproof initially. So you've got to do some additional work to set them up before you go out to the field. Those are just a couple of the sensors that are out there. Magtech and other vendors make these same sorts of things, and so if you're interested in doing this, you can potentially shop around and find something that fits your needs. And then down lower in this graph are just some different sensor packages that are more or less mounted on different platforms. You can fly over streams to collect temperature data. You can put out hawk hydro labs, etc. Lots of different things going on now to collect more temperature information. The things we're going to focus on here today with the underwater epoxy protocol, though, are these small, compact digital temperature sensors that are easily attached to rods. So, given that, we've got a lot of need for collecting more full year data. We've got the instruments now, we think, that can do it. Kind of the last big obstacle then, as I alluded to before, is that when you're working in mountain stream environments, these are highly dynamic systems. You've got, in most regions of the world, snowpacks that accumulate in these systems during the winter, and then as it warms up in the spring and the summer, that melts and runs off, and so you get these big snowmelt flood peaks every year. And, that typically will mobilize the stream bed. It'll do a lot of things that potentially can destroy instruments that you put in these systems. One of the positive things about that high amount of energy in these systems, though, is it also recruits large substrates to these systems. So there's also a lot of big rocks in streams, some of which are large enough that they're typically not mobilized by a big flood. And so we kind of put two and two together with this, and we thought, well, if we can find, some glues, and we've got these small digital temperature sensors, a lot of times they're no bigger than about the size of a quarter, wouldn't it be possible to simply glue these things onto the downstream side of a rock that's big enough that it's not going to go anywhere in a flood, and then you're basically using that large rock as kind of a shield against that temperature sensor. And, you pick a good rock that's big enough that it's not going to go anywhere, you should have a safe little habitat for that sensor to live for a year or 5 years, depending on how long you're going to keep it out there. So that was kind of the genesis of the idea. The next thing was to try to implement it, and so we looked around. We tried to find a variety of different underwater epoxies from different vendors so that we could run kind of a comprehensive test. We evaluated 8 different products for this particular protocol. Initially, we tested these in the laboratory just to get a sense of how easy was it to work with these things, because ultimately we're going to be trying to do this out in the field under field conditions. So we needed something that wasn't too difficult to work with. It also needed to obviously perform well under really controlled, relatively benign conditions. And so if these candidate epoxies weren't strongly adhering sensors to rocks within a laboratory environment, then there's no way they were ever going to do it in a dynamic field environment. So we tested a bunch of these things, but the clear winner, based on our tests, at least in the laboratory conditions, was a product that's made by Fox Industries. It's what they call FX764. It's a 2-part epoxy, and so basically you just grab a little bit of each type of epoxy, you blend it together wearing gloves so that it doesn't get on your skin, and after a few minutes you end up with kind of a gray sort of putty that's flexible. And then the basic idea is that you just apply a little bit of that epoxy to the back of your temperature sensor, and then you just stick that on a rock. And in the case of the Fox product that we're using, it takes about 24 hours before it solidifies, but it does have a fairly gooey consistency, so even initially, once you've mixed it up and once you've stuck that temperature sensor onto a rock, it does a pretty good job of staying where you put it. Just as insurance will typically lean a rock against our sensors in the field just to kind of hold them there for that first hour or two as it's starting to set up. But once that's been done, then these things seem to do a pretty good job of staying where you put them. And literally then, once that glue sets up, it's almost like it's been cemented onto the rock. And so that's good for what we want. But in some cases, if you had to retrieve that sensor, that can be a little bit of a challenge. If you wanted to physically remove it from the rock, typically you're looking at having to use something like a chisel or a small screwdriver to kind of chip it off the rock. So we felt like we had something fairly promising with the Fox Epoxy in combination with the small digital temperature sensors, but we still needed to do some field validation work just to confirm that the method that we were trying to develop wasn't going to give us biased results. And so the first thing we wanted to assess in our field trials was whether or not attaching these things to large rocks was going to potentially bias our temperature readings simply by the large rocks, which are a lot of times are large enough that they're sticking above the low flow weathered width of the stream and gathering heat energy from the sun. There's the possibility that that heat energy could be transferred into the temperature sensor. And so the first thing we did to evaluate that in our field trials was to, one, find big black rocks, something that is kind of going to push the limits of where we might see something happening that were gaining a lot of heat energy during the summer, attach temperature sensors to those. The arrow points to a sensor location. And then we also, at these same sites, put out temperature sensors that we held on the bottom of the stream by putting rocks on top of them, but they weren't directly in contact with a large rock the way they were with the epoxy protocol. And so we had a treatment and a control temperature sensor at 8 or 9 different locations, and we simply compared the temperature readings then that we were getting at both of those sensor locations at the individual sites across those sites. And it's a little bit hard potentially to read the numbers here at the bottom of this table, but the take-home was that we couldn't see any measurable difference in the temperature readings between the sensors that were attached to rocks and the control sensors that weren't attached to the rocks. And so, this is part of what was published then in the North American Journal of Fisheries Management a few years ago as this validation work. The other thing, or one of the other things that we wanted to test in this protocol then was whether or not direct exposure to the sun was potentially going to bias our results. And so, it's easy to stick a temperature sensor on a rock and just leave it do its thing, but depending on what the sun angle is coming over that rock, once you have direct solar radiation hitting those things, the potential is there that it could potentially bias your results. And so what we did in that case was to attach temperature sensors to our rocks, some of which had solar shields on them, and some of which did not. And this graph then just shows the temperature traces for 4 different temperature sensors that were deployed in the field, and these were all attached to the same rock. And then this is the temperature trace over the span of 7 or 8 days, each of those cycles representing 1 day. Approximately halfway through that trial then, here at about time 180 or 200, we removed the solar shields from 2 of those temperature sensors. So we've got the control data here where everything is being treated the same way. Everything has a solar shield on it. Here we remove the solar shields, and you can immediately start to see spikes occurring in those temperature records. So this told us basically that it's probably going to be mandatory that these things are also shielded from direct exposure to the sun. And at our field trial sites, then we've got some estimates of the magnitude of that potential bias if you don't have a solar shield. I think it's somewhere on the order of 0.2 to 0.5 degrees Celsius per day, just depending on whether you're looking at a mean daily temperature or a maximum daily temperature. And so our solution to this was just to develop a fairly inexpensive and flexible solar shield. We tried a bunch of different things here, and I'll talk about another solar shield that we've also developed a little bit later in the presentation. But our initial efforts at developing a solar shield just consisted of using a small patch of neoprene with a couple cable ties. The onset temperature sensors that we're using have a small little tab at the top of the sensor. It's got a hole already in it, which was convenient then for running those cable ties through and attaching this neoprene flap. And so, for $1 or $2, whatever the cost is for a small patch of neoprene, we've got a fairly durable solar shield now. And some of the field deployments we've done, we're seeing these things easily last up to a couple years. We haven't had sensors out longer than that, but we're getting good retention of these solar shields. Another nice thing about this neoprene approach is that over time, as these things sit in the stream, you'll have periphyton actually colonizing the surface of this neoprene, and so it begins to pretty quickly blend in with its surroundings, which almost makes these temperature sensors invisible. So if you're working in a place that has a lot of high human traffic, it's not uncommon for people to, when they see things in streams, want to pick it up, take it home with them. This is an option that helps you kind of camouflage your sensor. So our experience has been we can put these out even near campgrounds and places that people are walking by them all the time, but it's virtually invisible, so you get better retention with regards to people not stealing these, taking them home. One modification that we've also done to these neoprene solar shields is we started attaching a small lead weight to the outer edge of that solar shield, and that just helps make sure that the flap kind of hangs down over the front of the sensor, so that as you get currents and other things buffeting that flap, you're not potentially flipping it up and allowing sunshine to directly hit the solar shield, or excuse me, the temperature sensor. So the last big question then we wanted to address with this underwater epoxy protocol is obviously just the question of how durable are these installations going to be. That's the big motivation ultimately for getting into this was, would these things stay where we put them? And so in the winter and the spring of 2010, we went out and we instrumented 11 different sites on 11 different rocks in streams in central Idaho. And then we went through a big snowmelt runoff. We actually, in this particular instance, this is the discharge data from one of our study streams, and so we had some big spikes actually in runoff that were a lot higher than the flows that we typically get, and so we ran these things through some pretty extreme conditions during that first set of field trials. The two photos down here just show the same rock that we looked at previously. This is that same location now at flood stage, where you can see the water level is up by 2 or 3 feet, and that sensor is down here somewhere still doing its job. This first field trial then, we put out 11 sensors, came back in the summer of 2010 to check whether they were still there, and in 9 of the 11 cases, so about 82%, the sensors were still there and were functioning as we'd hoped they would be. That encouraged us sufficiently that we wanted to try to do a larger scale field test, and so later in 2010 then, we put out 300 temperature sensors using the epoxy protocol across the state of Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, and then a few temperature sensors even in Nevada. We tried to bracket and get a wide range of stream conditions, and so one of the things that we thought might be most important in terms of affecting retention success was just the steepness of a stream, because that gives us some indication of the amount of power and energy that it has at higher flows. And so we put these sensors out in a range of conditions, from fairly low gradient systems that are more typical of larger larger rivers that kind of meander back and forth gently, to really high gradient, high energy steep mountain streams with gradients up to 16%. So those went out the summer of 2010. This last summer in 2011, we revisited about 86 of these sites. At those 86 sites then, 3/4 of the sensors were still there doing their job, collecting temperature data. I'll point out that the runoff year that we had in the spring of 2011 was an above-average year. So again, we tested these things under some pretty rigorous field conditions. Just 74%, that's an average across all sites, including the really high gradient sites. If you constrain the sorts of streams that you're looking at to something that's a little bit more benign, and you're looking at stream slopes that are 3% or less, which typically constitutes the great bulk of most river networks, the retention success was somewhat higher and averaged about 85%. And this graph then just summarizes in a continuous manner what that effect of stream slope is relative to the proportion of sensors that we had retained. This blue line is just the predicted mean relationship from a logistic regression, and these red X's then just show, give you a yes or a no, depending on whether or not the sensor was retained at a site. And so you can see in these lower slope systems, lower gradient, we're approaching upwards of 90% retention, and then as you get into a higher and higher stream slope, that just decreases a little bit, or a lot actually. But again, the places that constitute the largest bulk of stream networks, typically in this range. So we've got, we think, a system now that works pretty well under most common stream environments and the sorts of places that we'd like to monitor. So this slide then just shows some photos of what a typical field site looks like after you instrument it. And in here we're looking at the direct sensor attachment method, where we just put the epoxy right on the sensor, and then the sensor goes right on the rock. In each case, the red arrow in these photos then points to the sensor, and you can see that in all cases you've got that neoprene flap, that solar shield on top of the sensor. And you can also see, a little bit harder to see, but notice in this photo at least, and this photo, there's a rock also then leaning against the temperature sensor, and that again is just to hold it in place for that first hour or two while the epoxy is setting up. And then at that point, these things are pretty well cemented in place, and they're not going to go anywhere. Because we're not necessarily coming back to these sites that frequently, then we'll typically also add a metal tag, a numbered tag, that's also glued onto the rock using the box epoxy, and we'll also, in some cases, put a little bit of white spray paint on the rock, just so that when we or someone else comes back to these sites 1, 2, 5 years in the future, it's going to be a little bit easier to find that exact same site. And so one of the things that we noticed in the summer, this last summer, 2011, when we went back to those 86 sites that we used to assess our retention success, and we checked the sensors, that first year we were basically gluing these things directly onto rocks. We weren't providing the sensor any sort of protection, and one of the things we noticed is that, on the onset sensors at least, there's 2 small glass bulbs on the faceplates of those things that are used for doing the optical downloads. And in a lot of cases, it was pretty common for one or both of those glass bulbs to be clipped off. And presumably what's happening is that during high flows, you've got small pea gravels and other things that are just kind of suspended in the flows, and those are at some point coming by the sensor and clipping those off. In terms of the sensor still collecting data, it doesn't seem to affect that, and so these things are still blinking away, still collecting information. But it does make it impossible then at that point to download the sensor without having to send it back into the vendor. And so one of the things that we wanted to come up with this last year, and that we started prototyping now, is is going to what we call the PVC container method, and this in, same basic idea, but now instead of directly attaching the temperature sensor onto a rock, we're putting that sensor in a protective housing, and we're then using the epoxy to glue that housing onto the rock instead. And we think this has several advantages, in addition to providing better protection for the sensors so that they're not going to be damaged or destroyed. It's also going to make those sensors really easy to replace. And so at the end of the service life of that particular instrument, whether that's 1 year or 5 years from now, you come back to this site, you can just unscrew the top of these, pull out the existing sensor, put in a new sensor, and you're good to go. And so that's going to make long-term monitoring at sites much easier than it would be if, say, we had to reestablish this site, play around with setting up the epoxy, gluing something else on the rock. It also makes it a lot easier to do periodic data downloads. One of the things that originally interested us in doing this was that Onset makes an underwater data shuttle, which we thought, well, this is great if we can glue these things on rocks, and then we can just come there with the data shuttle, retrieve the data underwater. We don't have to really ever uninstall our sensors. But again, that problem with slight damage to the glass beads that are used for the downloads gets in the way of performing those underwater downloads. And so this makes it possible then to simply unscrew the temperature sensor from its housing, pull it up above the water surface, and download it onto any sort of field computer. Obviously, then it protects it better than just having these things out there naked sitting on the rocks. It also provides, a really good solar shield to these things. It's difficult to imagine there being too much sunlight getting into these things, given that they're all almost entirely encased within these PVC housings. The one kind of unknown at this point is that we haven't yet gone back to revisit as many of these PVC casing sites because we just put those out this last summer. So it's not clear at this point yet whether or not we're going to get as high a retention success with this type of housing as we are with the direct attachment method. But that's something, again, we've got several hundred sensors out there now that are sitting in these PVC housings that we'll go back to in subsequent years to continue quantifying that retention success. So in terms of the equipment that you need then to actually install sensors, it's pretty low tech. And that's again one of the appeals for us working in the Forest Service. We have to hike into a lot of these streams. You're carrying stuff for miles a lot of times on your back, and so you don't want to be having to deal with a lot of heavy equipment, as maybe has been the case in the past when people tried to instrument sites for permanent temperature monitoring. So now, this is basically all you need to set up a site. You've got your epoxy, you've got your data shuttle. That's kind of an optional thing, but that's what I alluded to with regards to being able to do an underwater download. Metal tags, you can get those easily from forestry supply companies, and we'll use that then to monument the rock that temperature sensor gets attached to. You've got your temperature sensors, a wire brush. We'll use those typically to scrape off the surface of the rock, make sure we've got a good clean surface before we attach our temperature sensor. Rubber gloves to keep the epoxy from getting on your hands. And then we've also found a plastic view box to be a useful thing, and that basically just allows you to lay that view box on top of the water surface and get a really clear view of that attachment site where you're putting a temperature sensor, or to inspect the temperature sensor after it's in place, just to feel confident that you've got a good adhesion to that rock surface. This slide just kind of sums it all up then. Basically now we've got a pretty good system using the underwater epoxy with the modern digital temperature sensors that can collect a lot of data at a site for a long time, where for $100, maybe a little bit more than that, you've got a system now where you can collect and monitor stream temperature data continuously at a site for upwards of 5 years. And so now that it's easy to do, it's such an important variable. Lots of people are starting to do it. This map just shows kind of the emerging regional temperature sensor network that's out in the northwestern U.S., where people now are actively monitoring full-year stream temperatures. Not all the points on this map are instrumented using this underwater epoxy protocol, but the vast majority of the green sites, which are Forest Service sites, have been instrumented using the underwater epoxy. And as of 2 years ago, none of those sites were on the map. So this is rapidly growing. A lot of people are applying it. And I'll point out, too, that we have not yet updated this map with the 1,000 or so new sites that we and other agencies have instrumented this last year, many of which were done using underwater epoxy. And so it's easy to do, it's valuable, and so it's just exploding the amount of full-year temperature monitoring that's going on now. And there's going to be a tremendous amount of utility that we can get from that sort of full-year data. This is just kind of a quick bullet list of some of the things that we'll be using this information for. Probably the most important thing on this list is simply the fact that now that it's easy to do, there's going to be a lot more people doing it, and that's also going to make it a lot easier to do long-term trend monitoring, which is really important for understanding environmental changes that might be associated with land management or climate change. Some of the other things, just quickly, we think we're going to be able to get a much better definition of thermal criteria and the thermal niches that aquatic organisms need now, that we can go to specific places within stream networks, put temperature sensors there where we know certain thermal tolerances are exceeded, directly measure those things over the course of a year or multiple years, and know exactly what it is that regulates the distribution of organisms in streams. We're going to be able to characterize full-year thermal regimes as opposed to looking at just the summer maxima temperatures, which we've focused the vast majority of our efforts on in the past. All the data that are collected using or full-year data that are going to be collected by this means and others can feed directly into predictive models that we're developing and others are developing to be able to map out stream temperature patterns across river networks and regional drainages so that we can better understand the effects of climate change. We're going to be able to use these sorts of data for short-term sensitivity analyses, wherein we just look at the relative changes across hundreds of different temperature sensors during, say, 2 different contrasting climate years to get a sense of which sites and which types of streams might be more or less sensitive to climate forcing. And then, as I alluded to at the beginning of this slide, just going to make doing long-term monitoring much easier, and in some cases then, if we can get enough full-year data at a site, 2, 3 years, etc., we think we'll be able to make some link functions to the nearest long-term air temperature and discharge monitoring stations so that we can reconstruct stream temperatures going back 50 or 60 years at a site. So getting this sort of full-year data is just going to open up a whole suite of possibilities that we're really excited about. If you want to know more about this then, or get into some of the details, there's a couple different publications out there that are particularly relevant. First of which is the paper that we published in North American Journal of Fisheries Management in 2011, and this is just in the field test and validation work. This will have more details on exactly what the numbers are that were the result of that. And then we've also developed a detailed how-to guide, which is has lots of pictures, lots of detailed instructions on how you establish sites. And both of these then are available for download off the U.S. Forest Service stream temperature website that we maintain. And to find that website then, just do a Google search on stream temperature Forest Service, and it should pop up somewhere near the top of the list. Both of those documents, as well as other things that we're doing that pertain to climate change and thermal regimes and streams, are all available at that particular site. And then to conclude this presentation then, I think now we're going to flip over